Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out, and thank you, Anita, for that really important introduction and grounding. From Turtle Island to Gaza to Palestine, we know that issues of freedom of access to information, of occupation, are issues that link us all. So I'm glad to be here and to be in conversation with these incredible activists and organizers about their work around censorship within and outside prison walls. So I wanted to start by asking all three of you, and maybe we could start with Kyon, moving outwards. How did you come into this work, and why has this work been important to you?
Thank you, Fathima, for that. Definitely want to take a moment to acknowledge, Gaza and Palestinian folks and what's taking place. But yes, for your question, I have essentially would like to say it's my lived experience, being incarcerated for not just criminality, but also being stripped of my status. Therefore, I'm now living in Canada without status for several years now. And essentially, double jeopardy is what has occurred. And based upon my lived experience being incarcerated for criminality and also incarcerated for immigration detention, and being a long-term detainee is where that comes from. Yeah.
That you were involved in organizing a hunger strike around some of these issues when you were being detained. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, so definitely I've been involved in several hunger strikes throughout my time of incarceration, both on criminal detention, and also on immigration detention. The matters are pretty similar with each other, or the issues are pretty similar, just different name, different institution. So example, there was a hunger strike for immigration detention in 2016, where there's 191 individuals or detainees that was protesting our living condition in Lindsay, Ontario, being detained in a maximum security prison for immigration detention, which is a civil matter, compared to being housed in a holding center located at Rexdale Boulevard. And then, of course, most recently during the pandemic, I was incarcerated for or serving a criminal sentence at that point in time. And during that time, we had a hunger strike in order to draw attention to our living conditions or lack thereof, being provided information of what was essentially what was being taken away, what were the new restrictions being implemented, or what was the institution's response to COVID, such as we had issues knowing that the kitchen was still operational, yet inmates could not receive visits from their loved ones. Healthcare was still open, but you could not go to healthcare. They would send someone to you, and essentially you had to relay what your injury, what your concern is to an officer, and then they will now make a telephone call to healthcare to see if it meets whatever procedure or policy they had in order to say, yes, bring them over to healthcare, we'll see them, and escort you over. Furthermore, it was problematic knowing that it's okay to keep the inmates working in close proximity in a conjugated setting, such as the kitchen, versus shutting down the kitchen and shutting down the employment and hiring outside catering companies in order to bring in individual meals, sealed meals, which would be a more humane approach, especially considering that we're in a pandemic, as they said, but that was not the case. Again, that had to do to a cost, and of course, the dollar for inmate labor versus the cost that it would have, been for hiring catering company. Now, it was also problematic during our hunger strike was also raising concerns because our conditions was problematic, knowing that the library was shut down school was shut down, and the last thing that was still available was institutional programming. So the institutional correctional programming that's implemented by CSC at the federal level, that was widely available. There's still, you can still go to, but you cannot access educational programming such as school, or you cannot access going to a library and choosing books in the federal system, or at least in the federal institution. And it was even more disgusting that they actually used, or they shut down our library and turned it into a storage department for tables and chairs from other rooms inside the institution. So that was definitely problematic, and we're raising concerns about that. And in return, they actually told us, hey, we'll open the library if you can get an inmate to actually use their recreational time to open and be available to sign and register, or sign out books and register folks, keep track of books that are coming in and out of the space. And they also need an officer to agree to supervise and open the space for the inmates to get access to it. And of course, no officer signed up for that, and no inmate signed up for that, so the space just remained closed and was never operational during the pandemic. So you went without books. Yeah.
Thank you. Garrett, do you want to talk about your experience coming into this work?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Good evening, everyone. It's a real honor to be here tonight with you all and with these panelists. So the first time I guess I went into a prison, I was a graduate student. This would have been maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and I was sort of wanting to start a radical study group inside a minimum security prison in Portland, Oregon. And we had been doing that for some time, and I was getting donated books and bringing them in and giving them to people, and sort of realized the lack of sustainability around that from a just a purely financial standpoint, and got this idea of building a freedom library within the prison. And I was very cute and naive, and I thought, like, oh, this is so great. I'm getting all these books in, and almost nothing's being censored. We were bringing in Our Prison's Obsolete and Asada and some of those books that you hear about a lot being censored. And eventually this freedom library had 300-400 books in it, and I had been working with the head of education at the prison to build this library and find a space for it. And one day I asked to see where it was located, and we went into the very small prison library space, and then deep within the library was a closet where all these books were locked. And basically the 12 or so people who were in Liberation Literacy, as our group was known, had access to maybe the one book that we were all reading at that time. And this was an early experience for me in sort of the mechanisms of censorship inside the prisons, which is that you can work with DOC officials, start to think that you're, eliding some of the censorship happening, but ultimately a prison is always going to be a place of punishment, and see books as another mechanism and lever to create some people who are deserving and others who aren't, and use it to punish some people and reward others. So that was sort of an early experience for me, and kind of led me to the work I do now with Study and Struggle, which does not partner in any way with people working for prisons. We send books individually to people according to the mail policies of the prison, which is that you can individually mail books from an approved vendor. And we sort of facilitate people hosting their own radical study groups in Mississippi. And alongside doing that work, I've also been writing this biography of a former political prisoner, Martin Sostre. And I'll try to just give a very brief gloss of Martin's relationship to censorship. He was actually, he began in Buffalo, New York, just over the border, one of the first revolutionary black bookstores in the United States in the mid-1960s. He was just coming out of a 12-year prison sentence, and he was eventually, during the 1967 uprising in Buffalo, framed and sentenced to 31 to 41 years by an all-white jury. Before that act of censorship for his revolutionary bookstore, he was a politicized prisoner. He was a part of the Nation of Islam in prisons during the late 1950s and participated in a really robust group of communal study in the prison yard, which included language, history, political science. And one of the things that they did was they built their own library of sorts, because at this point, incarcerated people in the United States did not have constitutional rights. They were considered, in the eyes of the state, quote, slaves of the state. So these Muslims in New York would study together and then pool their resources, which they were told that they could eventually have but not share, which is another theme that I think we'll see continues to this day. And they pulled these together into this wooden cupboard that they had built in the prison yard. And in the late 1950s, this wooden library essentially was raided, and Martin was thrown in solitary confinement. And this was related to his lawsuits against the state for the religious rights of Muslims. He eventually won some landmark cases which established the constitutional rights of incarcerated people. And for that, he also spent the final 5 years of that sentence in solitary confinement. Now fast forward to when he's a political prisoner in 1968, having gotten this 31 to 41 year sentence. He again was a trained jailhouse lawyer and began filing lawsuits around these constitutional rights which he had won during his first sentence. And many of these were around censorship, because at that time he was a revolutionary political prisoner. He was getting the writings of the Republic of New Africa, the Black Panther Party, or trying to access these. He was not successfully getting them. And he won a landmark lawsuit, a landmark case in Judge Constance Baker Motley's court in 1970, as well as one specifically around prison censorship in 1971 called Sostre v. Otis, which established the due process rights of incarcerated people to appeal any decision. All of these rights are completely trampled to this day. I hope I'll have time later to share sort of the work that we're doing with Study and Struggle, challenging all of these rights that Martin successfully won. But I'll wrap up by saying he won his emancipation in 1976 by building an international defense campaign. And when he got out, he said he was returning to minimum security. And by doing that, what he was drawing attention to is the fact that the prison is simply a microcosm of society. It is not an exceptional space. And when we talk about prison censorship or prison book bans, we often sort of elide the way in which this is really about building fascism from the inside out. So the fascism that Martin experienced in the 1950s when he was trying to access the Quran, in the 1960s when he was trying to sell books by Chairman Mao in Buffalo, and in the 1970s when he was trying to access the works of Peter Kropotkin and anarchists. Whether he was inside or outside, he was experiencing the fascism of the state, which is what led him to be a revolutionary anarchist. So I think one of the things to keep in mind as we talk about prison censorship is that it is simply a form and a mechanism of a much larger system of repression that we are living under. And somehow that's an introduction, I guess, to how I got into this work. Thanks.
Thank you. I want us to return to these issues that both of you have raised about the blurring of the lines of inside and outside. Kirsten, you're a librarian. You work inside and outside the prisons. Can you talk to us about that?
Yes. Yes, I am a librarian. Have been one since 2003. And that entire time, I have been also a volunteer inside various correctional institutions in Alberta and then in Manitoba. I think I was drawn to this work. I mean, first of all, on a personal level, I worked with someone at the University of Alberta who I learned had been incarcerated and just felt very lost and ashamed, and until she got the job of being the inmate librarian. And I was really inspired by that, and so I went with her to take a look at this institution and look at the library, and it needed a lot of work. I was happy that it had served such a wonderful purpose for Suzanne, but it was really in pretty dreadful shape. We did a lot of work at that prison. It was a federal institution. I then moved to Manitoba, where I then started going into prisons there and realized that none of the provincial prisons in Manitoba have libraries. And, you know, we're talking about correctional centers with 800 people, and I was taken down to this basement, you know, through the heavy door, all stone and clanging behind you. And the teacher showed me the library, which was maybe 2 shelves, half filled with old paperbacks of romances. And this is for a men's prison of about 800. So libraries have never been a priority in prisons, and my sort of guiding principle and what I always sort of work at as a librarian is that libraries and librarians have a role in bringing social justice in our communities and for our community members. And so that really kind of guides us in our work. What also guides us in our work is that we really, of course, believe in access to information and access to books for all, and that includes for our incarcerated community members. Those folks have the same needs as you all here in this library, and then more. But they aren't given that same privilege, and it is seen to be a privilege. I know you mentioned how that privilege was also taken away. These folks are already being punished. There is no need to be taking books or taking library programming and services away as further punishment. In fact, it is a right, their right. When the door slams behind them in prison, it doesn't mean that they lose all of their rights to information. But that is what is happening. Another thing that is really, really important for us to recognize and acknowledge in our work is the history of colonization and systemic racism within both the institutions of libraries and prisons. And so we keep that at the forefront of our work. And I just want to mention just a few stats. I was on the Stats Canada website before I came here. For all you geeks out there, they have a really, really great site that lists all of the statistics for corrections within Canada. 71% of incarcerated people in Canada are in remand. So remand is a court-ordered temporary detention of a person while awaiting trial or sentencing. In Ontario, it's 79%. Bail is used more frequently than remand for non-Indigenous people. Meanwhile, the rates of incarceration of Indigenous people is shameful in Canada. In Canada, we have 5% of our population is Indigenous. 31% of our incarcerated population are Indigenous. In Manitoba, it's we have 18% of our general population are Indigenous, as we've seen from our Manitoba provincial election, where we just elected our first First Nations premier. So we have a large population, but we also have 76% of incarcerated folks are Indigenous. This is shameful. So we really believe that it is up to us as librarians, as folks that are trying to bring in library services, books. It's actually not just about the books. After talks like this, people always say, how can I get books in? Actually, the books are the starting point. Then with the books, we create relationships. And then we are able to do programming and services, and really ultimately what we now seek to do is to create, I think it was mentioned in my introduction, a moment. Sometimes it's just a moment, that humanizing moment where we maybe sometimes just share a smile, maybe a book, maybe reintroduce a book to someone, just to bring some sort of humanity into a very inhumane space. I could go on and on, but I won't.
One thing I'm thinking about then, as you talk about books as, just the starting point, and a starting point into building relationships, right? Like approaching this idea of prison censorship as a question of relationality. The poll was really interesting, that there's this assumption that we in the audience are more likely to imagine ourselves as the prison warden than as the prisoner. And yet, as we've discussed and as we've seen, in fact, the reality is many of us are at risk of incarceration, not only because of criminal sentencing, but one of the points that Kirsten brought up was that when she says that 70 to 80% of people in detention are in remand, what that means is they have not yet been found guilty, and they're being incarcerated anyway. So being innocent is not in fact a defense. Or when we think about Kyon's comment at the beginning of this panel around immigration detention, these are people who have been detained, including in some cases babies, because their status, their immigration status, which is not a crime in Canada, was considered inadequate in some way. And so there's this idea of prisons as being these rehabilitative spaces, right? The idea is someone commits a crime, we send them to jail, and it's like being grounded. Now you can think about what you've done wrong and you'll come out a better person. And yet even Kyon's story at the beginning about how during the pandemic we saw all of these programs being stripped away, that even healthcare was difficult to access, but educational programs were being canceled. So I'm thinking about some of the conversations that we had just before we got on this stage around how not only was it difficult to get books, and maybe Kyon, you can talk about your experience trying to order books and have them arrive in the prison, but Garrett, you and both of you had talked about the difficulties then sharing readership between prisoners and the kinds of forced agreements that prisoners are required to enter into, which is not really an agreement, to not share their materials. Would you mind talking about that?
Yeah, definitely. So what I would say is difficult when it comes, accessing books is difficult on its own, considering that you cannot go to an actual physical library. So when we say that institutions have a library, please know that we don't actually get to walk down to a library and say, hey, I want this book or this title off of this shelf, and you go to a counter and you check it out and you go back to your cell and you have a book you can read and indulge into for however long. Really what the process looks like is a librarian who volunteers or has a volunteer loads a lot of books on a cart, a push cart, and goes from unit to unit and essentially keeps track or has a list of folks' institutional number and their name and what book or what title they've taken out and how many they've taken out and if they returned it or not, or they lost it, whatever the case may be. But essentially, that's what that process looks like. But of course, if you want to get books sent to you from your loved ones in the community, your supporters, say, hey, I want to send you a book, I want to send you some reading material, well, you can do two things. They can send you or subscribe to a newspaper and have a newspaper sent or delivered in your name from a pre-approved that the institution has some form of contract with, then you can receive that. But of course, if you do sign up for newspaper and get access that way, you won't actually get it on the day of. It can be like 3-4 days later, you're receiving that print. When it comes to actual books though, don't expect to receive a book if you put it in this week and think that Amazon's gonna deliver it tomorrow, Express, Amazon Prime, you're gonna get that delivered. That's not how it works. You're gonna wait a minimum 2 to 3 months just to receive that book. And even then, that's just being fanciful or just, trying to be cagey or give a reasonable time frame. But in all actuality, it can arrive anywhere from 3 months onwards before you actually receive whatever title that you requested. And of course, you may have waited that long only to find out that whatever sergeant, which is a supervisor on shift, says, well, no, you can't have this book, and it was returned or sent back to the sender. And you now have to say, well, hey, what was their reason? What did they tell you why it was denied or why you can't have it? And say, screw you, I'm gonna have it sent a second time. But of course, this is the cost out of your pocket or your loved one's community support. It's out of their pocket for that expense to have it reshipped to the institution and wait multiple months until you can see if it actually gets in the institution or not. Considering that they have their predetermined list of like banned subjects that you can have. One of them primarily is hood books, which is urban books, urban authors, and you can't have access to those books. Or there's certain certain like political books or folks who write about politics. Like for example, there is the one author, Abdul Jamal. At one point, did not allow his book to be sent in the institution for whatever reason. But no, so that's what I'll share on that.
And you were also talking about trying to share your books with other people on the range in the unit. How does that work out?
Okay, so there's also an issue there too. So yes, if you live on the same range or the same area, you can say, hey, take this book for the night or take for a week, whatever, give it back to me whenever you're finished. You can do that. But if you want to send a book over to someone that lives in another enclosed pod or area, you can't do that. Officially, their stance on record is that's not allowed. But of course, there's always the gray area discrepancy regarding if you have a familiarity with a certain guard or relation. You can say, hey, miss, sir, can you please send this to such and such? They live over here, this cell located, and can you pass this on? They have nothing, they just got here, and I want to make sure they have something. And yes, in that context, you may be able to get somebody to say, you know what, I'll do this for you, but don't ask me again. This is the one-time thing. Or if you're got a good enough report, then they'll do it on a consistent basis. But officially, you're not allowed to send books. And one of the main issues, like personally for me, I didn't like books being sent from my loved ones, supporters in the community when I was incarcerated, both for criminal and immigration detention, considering that when books are sent to you from the outside, books are automatically stamped with the institution that you're in, becoming their property, and it now goes to their library. And I was not fond of knowing that money that be spent to support me and helped me out through my incarceration or my detention is now going towards building this capitalist or this prison industrial complex library. Like, nah, screw that. What the heck? Keep my money. Or you know what, you guys spend on something else, because one, it's gonna take forever to get here. Two, I'm not gonna be able to leave with it when I want it. And three, I'm not gonna be building no damn library for someone else and knowing that the guys can't even access the library anyway, so they don't even know if that certain book that I really liked is actually sitting on that shelf and they can get access to it. No, it just sits there, collects dust. Yeah, no.
Yeah, listening to you talk about that, I guess one of the things that comes to mind, or that I think is worth sharing with you all, is communalism is criminalized in the prison in every form. There is no institution, and this is saying something given the institutions we have outside, there's no institution that is more individualizing and atomizing than the prison. So it's not just about having a book that you can't share. You can't meet with a group larger than sometimes 2 or 3 people, right? That's considered unauthorized gathering, right? At every form or attempt to break out of an individualized mindset in the prison is criminalized within that setting. And everyone within the prison is told that the reason that they are there is because of some sort of failing on their part. It's not because of some sort of systemic, community-wide, genocidal, oppressive thing. It's because it is their own individual failing. And those things are connected. And I think one of the things that's important when we talk about censorship in prison is that if we frame it correctly, it can actually tell us about the function of the prison in society. So the way that we talk about censorship, like as we're talking about these books, I reach this point where I almost think, it's not clear why they're doing this, right? Like it sounds, as we're saying all this stuff up here, it probably sounds absurd, right? We can talk about them confiscating atlases so people don't escape, confiscating cookbooks, confiscating this and that, right? And it reaches this level of absurdity that's almost imprecise, where we're not actually talking about why they do this. And the reason why the prison does not want these materials inside is because these are potentially revolutionary groups of people. The function of the prison is to take all the dissidents in society, all the groups of people who could potentially overthrow the state and incapacitate them in a place. And the last thing that they want for this group of incapacitated groups of people who have revolutionary power is to understand their circumstances in its context, rather than as their own individual failings, but as a sort of oppressed group that has a legacy of resistance that they can tap into. So when people access the sorts of literature, I mean, you can probably guess where I'm coming from, access of literature in prisons, right? Like I'm coming from, the point is to abolish the prison. That is why I'm even interested in sending material inside. So the types of materials I'm sending inside to people are ones that would help people understand themselves in context and be able to revolt against that. But the reason the prison does not want that and fights so hard against it is because people begin to have language and context and lineage for their own lives to understand that this is not their own failing, that they are in this point. They are part of a long history of resistance and of state repression. And that is why the prison cares so much to censor this material. So I think there is an opportunity in getting involved in fighting censorship and to begin thinking about censorship where we can actually begin to understand the function of the prison in society, rather than just to see this as sort of like a description of a problem, prison censorship that needs to be fixed, right? It's not about fixing censorship in prison. It's about eradicating prisons so there is no censorship, because the prison is itself censorship. There is every aspect of it. We're talking about books. If you email with an incarcerated person, every email is read and censored. I get emails regularly, based on what I'm saying, obviously, that do not make it inside. I just get a JPay message that says this email was censored, meaning it did not get through. Every letter, I mean, the entire relationship that people have with their loved ones is mediated by the state. I have a comrade inside who recently, he's serving a sentence and trying to get out on clemency. And one of his friend's neighbors outside has a 7-year-old daughter who sent a message of support. And she held up a sign saying her support. And they attached it to an email. He was pulled aside by 2 guards and interrogated about his relationship to this 7-year-old. So this is the form where the people who are doing the censorship have these sort of like, their machinations of what's happening in this scenario get projected onto the people inside who are criminalized not once, but again and again through every relationship that they have. And every phone call, you know, people getting, I have another comrade whose wife went on a vacation and she sent him a photograph of herself in a bikini and they confiscated it and said this was explicit sexual content, right? So you have to understand that that Marilyn Buck, who was a revolutionary political prisoner, she said, imprisonment is an extreme form of censorship. And I think that is, to me, what is important about censorship is that the prison is itself an extreme form of censorship.
Thank you for that. It made me think about a moment in 2010 when I was in law school in Vancouver. And this was the previous year in 2009, the war in Sri Lanka was coming to an end, and it was extremely bloody, and much in very similar ways that Gaza is now being attacked. Mullawaikal, which is a part of Sri Lanka, was being bombed with phosphorus bombs, hospitals were being bombed, orphanages were being bombed, people were dying, and people were fleeing. And over the course of several months, families came on very dangerous boat rides and arrived in BC. There was one boat that arrived and it had a number of families on board, including young children. And what the Canadian government did was separate the families by gender. So boys over a certain age and men were held in a higher security facility, and women and children were held in a youth detention center in Burnaby. And so a number of us would organize to go and try and visit, so I was able to go inside and see these children who were experiencing much of what we're describing. And then we organized noise demos outside. And the reason I'm thinking of this story is because of this line that prison is censorship. So we organized noise demos, meaning we had protests outside the prison walls. And I put together a playlist of Tamil songs, and we were playing them, including nursery rhymes, so that the children inside would hear us and would understand, right? They had come from Sri Lanka, they spoke Tamil, they didn't speak English, many of them. And you could see from the prison walls, there was this one window that was barred, and you could see these children's faces coming up to the window because they could hear these songs, they recognized these songs, they were pop songs, they were nursery songs. And then at one point, on subsequent visits, we saw the prison guards pull them away from the bars until they couldn't even hear the music, like literally we're playing music. And so this idea of the prison itself as a construction, as an entity, is a censorship, not just of material books, but of conversation, of community, of connection, of music, like all of those things that we take so for granted in our daily lives. So I just wanted to add to that. Kirsten, and then...
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in terms of the censorship issue, I mean, really, librarianship, our values really do not mesh well with prison policies. Obviously, we have different kind of approaches to life. But I wanted to say that it's not just the radical books that are being censored, and I know that you mentioned that there was a list of maybe banned subjects. The problem is that provincially there are no guidelines or policies that are shared across the provincial institutions. Each institution may have some sort of policy, but probably not. And so it really becomes a very arbitrary event where a sergeant or a corrections officer or I'm not even sure who will look at a book and decide that it shouldn't be in the prison. We had some books by Drew Hayden Taylor, a Indigenous writer, and I think his Me Sexy book was not allowed in because of the cover. They obviously didn't even look at the content, and the cover wasn't even anything all that gratuitous. But there are these, so they censor no true crime. So everyone else in our society is obsessed with true crime, as are folks who are incarcerated, but no true crime. We don't worry about folks here learning how to be criminals by reading true crime. So why are we concerned about that inside the prisons? No hardcovers for a lot of the prisons. There's no internet. So when you say you're getting emails from people, that's great. But yeah, there's no internet. There are no real even computers that are new enough to be able to write resumes or use as word processing. These are all things that have been written up by the correctional investigators for years about the federal system, and it's even worse in the provincial system. Howard Zinger, who's the current correctional investigator, basically said information and technology is it's obsolete in prisons. And in fact, it's not just information poverty within the prisons, it's information depriving. And I think that is something that we all need to really think about, that this is not, we're not talking about Shawshank Redemption, we're not talking about Orange is the New Black. These are spaces where information is being deprived. We are very focused on bringing in Indigenous materials to the folks in Manitoba prisons because we believe that that they need to have access to information about Indigenous histories and cultures, but also to be able to have the tools to work through some of the intergenerational harms that have come up and the trauma through residential schools. Many folks are talking about correctional institutions in Canada as being just a second wave of residential schools. So that trauma keeps happening and keeps circling through. So we as librarians working within this type of these types of centers, it's very, very difficult because it goes against our librarian values, but also because we also know that many of those folks most of those folks, all of those folks should not be there. And yet we're still working within that system. And so it's a very, very difficult kind of path for us to work on. But we hear from loved ones, we hear from families, they want to bring in books. They are being blocked from doing so. So we try and do it for them. We've started up a Joe Big George collection and memorial collection, which is in honor of an elder who just recently passed away, where we're collecting Indigenous materials, Indigenous works, and this is in partnership with his partner. So. Yeah, I guess I just don't know what else to say, but the censorship happens at so many levels, as you were saying, and we just, keep pushing.
Yeah, I just want to jump in and pretty much speak to, for example, when Fathima was mentioning that when folks came out to support the Tamil families that were being detained in BC in the institution, and how music was being played, and the kids, or essentially the guards, moved the kids or moved folks from the window, so therefore they can no longer access or hear. Well, that also was something that took place with our current context for criminal and immigration detention. So when we had our hunger strike in 2016, or when we had most recently in 2020 or 2021, if I'm mistaken, hunger strike then, some of the tactics that the officers try to employ was when we had folks in the community come out to the institution in order to protest and lend solidarity to our cause and to amplify our voices. As they're outside the institution at the window, you can see them because they came to the space where we could look out the window and see them with drums, and us in return will bang on our windows, creating noise like, yes, we acknowledge you, we know you're out there, thank you, we appreciate it, yeah. But then of course what the officers start doing was unlocking us, or they changed the time for when we're supposed to be inside of our cell, which would coincide with the folks outside protesting, so we could see them in that solidarity, that joint solidarity acknowledging. Well, they changed the time for release to say, well, no, you got to come out your cell and you got to be in the day area, essentially, so therefore you can no longer be or have access or see. So the only thing is, folks are still on the telephone saying, hey, yes, we hear you out there, we see you, but they just told us that we gotta come out and we can't see you anymore, but we can hear you, like, don't worry, we appreciate it. Just in terms of trying to let them know, their action was appreciated. But that was just, a form of, again, censorship, where they're trying to cut off that connection and access, to folks. One of the other things that I want to mention too was, speaking again to the hunger strike, during the pandemic. So essentially we went on a hunger strike to draw attention to our living condition, which stemmed from lack of information that was being provided regarding what was taking place. So eventually our hunger strike did result in getting a memo or a newsletter from the warden, essentially signing off on it or putting his name in print, saying, hey, here are the upcoming things that we're going to be doing this week or within the next 2 weeks in the institution, to look out for, and how many cases they had of breakouts within the institution, and essentially trying to give some form of information, because that was initially one of our demands in our protests or in our hunger strike, was lack of information. And to be ill-informed or not informed at all is essentially you're killing us, and here it is, you're supposed to have this virus going around and it's killing folks, and yet here we are trying to find out and be informed so we can take measures and we can at least know what is happening, or, be engaged in the topic regarding our livelihoods, knowing that we are in a high-risk conjugated setting, yet we are not receiving any form of information. No, we had to call attention to that. Yeah, and of course we got information from the media first telling us that, hey, yes, there is a breakout in this institution and this inmate or this guard or 2 guards were sent home for quarantine, and we're saying, what? How come we didn't hear about this? Yet we're in the same institution. So that was definitely frustrating, and definitely, poured gasoline on the fire regarding, folks that was indecisive if we should be protesting or we should just, wait a little bit. For them, that was kind of like, nah, you know what? We got to do something. Yeah.
So we have 2 minutes left, and one of the things that I really wanted to flag very quickly, and is not so much a comment because we don't have time, is that prisoners aren't just readers, they're writers too, right? And so many of us in this room, on this panel, have been involved in projects that support writing efforts within the prison system. And of course, many of us have read works, influential, instrumental works by incarcerated writers, Malcolm X, Angela Davis, like so many other people, including Kyon, who has a chapbook that is being sold at Another Story bookstore, and we have a few copies on a table beside us, as well as other chapbooks that both Garrett and Kirsten have bought to show. So I do want you guys to check those out. And with the last 1 minute that we have, the question I wanted to ask you all is what are initiatives, groups, efforts that people on the outside can join or support addressing this issue of prisons as censorship?
I'll say that folks can join. There's Migrant Detainee Support Coalition, which I'm a founding member of, and essentially that has to do with immigration detention, and it's essentially raising awareness around the civil matter or civil issue. But of course, the more voices we have to amplify the concerns of immigration detainees is greatly appreciated. Further, definitely can look into Toronto Prisoner Rights Project, also doing some amazing work in terms of supporting folks that are detained in the provincial or just incarcerated in general. That was, speaking about Toronto Prison Rights Project, that was the organization that I did initially try to reach out to back in 2021 when I was incarcerated at the Medium Institution. And the concern there was around our living condition and protesting and being on hunger strike. And I tried to get information to them via correspondence through my legal counsel, and I try to take steps such as sending express posts, which you pay for out of your own commissary or your own canteen, and therefore you can be provided a tracking number, and yet the information or the tracking number is provided. One turned out to be false. Another showed that it was returned back to sender, and the institution on, I believe it was a total of 7 different correspondence to my counsel that was never received, and the institution has never returned those to me. So essentially, we know what happened there. It was confiscated, and the voice of the folks in protest or in hunger strike and what our demands were in order to get community organizers, to amplify our voice did not occur. It didn't stop us from what we had to do, because when you're on a hunger strike, it's ultimate sacrifice that you're saying in order to bring your cause and bring attention. But of course, it would have been great in order to have that information out there, but due to actions from the institution in order to censor and to stop, that's what took place. Another form of censorship the institution did was telephones. Essentially, if you're caught on the telephone speaking to your loved ones and so forth about any form of action, well, they'll now shut down access to your telephone and shut it off, and you'll be placed on like a 30-day ban from using a telephone. So that was something that was taking place to folks or happening to folks. So it kind of created a chill effect where folks did not really want to, speak up regarding our COVID conditions or speak up and try to draw attention. And also one of the things that Garrett mentioned that I wanted to speak on from earlier was regarding being caught speaking or being too many folks congregating at once, or you're automatically labeled or blacklisted as the ringleader. So when I'm going around signing folks up for petitions, I'm saying, hey, you got to get away from me. Sign this, I got to go. Give me a second, leave it over there and I'll pick it up later or something. Or give it to this person, and, so forth. Certain tactics that you have to, employ in order to not be labeled as the ringleader, trying to organize and get the information out to folks, but at the same time, not trying to prolong or procrastinate the situation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm out of my context, so most of mine are going to be like U.S. context. But you know, it's to get involved in fighting censorship in prisons is not a difficult thing to do. Like pretty much, if you find yourself in touch with a person in prison, you'll soon find yourself fighting prison censorship. So that's what I would encourage you all to do, is just get in touch with people inside. There's I don't know if there's Black and Pink chapters in Canada, but it's a pen pal program that supports queer folks in prison. Any sort of pen pal program, Books to Prisons programs, any abolitionist organization, the Anarchist Black Cross usually has like political prisoner letter writing nights. So if you just find your way to a relationship with someone inside, you'll be fighting prison censorship before you know it. And then thank you for shouting out the zines. So I should say, the ones that I brought, please take, because I don't want to have to bring them back with me. So Censored Women Speak, which is the Marilyn Buck, Susan Rosenberg one that I mentioned. Another one by my comrade Saphir, actually about phone resistance, and he was thrown in the hole for getting that out through email, so please read that. And what's the third one that I brought now? I can't even remember. Anyway, if there's a lot of copies of it, it's one of those. Yeah.
As the librarian on the panel, I will say that many public libraries have already made connections with prisons in their community. So you could always reach out to your public library. Library associations as well. Because this is being recorded, I'll say, in Alberta, in Edmonton, they have a prison libraries committee. Saskatchewan just started prison libraries committee, of course, the Manitoba one. So reach out to librarians. They can make some connections for sure. And I would also just like to bring your attention to the Prisoner's Right to Read. It is something that a bunch of librarians got together and wrote this, and it has been adopted by the Canadian Federation of Library Associations, and it just lays out a lot of sort of what our guiding principles are. So that would be a good thing to take away as well, and also the idea of community care and connections. That is really, and that's a Miriam Kaba really talks about collective care, and I think that's a really, really important thing to think about. Reaching out, like Garrett said, to just someone who is incarcerated, a family member who maybe needs some help in getting to the prison, or through your library, I think is a really good way to get involved. And just remember, it's not just about getting a book inside. It is about creating those relationships with our community members who we see walking down the street, who we see in the stacks at our local public library, or who we might see inside a prison. And I do have 3 chapbooks here. I have put on there just for viewing purposes only. I only have the last 3. I took 50 of them to the women's prison just before I came here. So, and we're going to be launching volume 2 in the new year. Thank you.